For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Gareth Newham of the ISS joins me to discuss corruption in the defence sector. How is the capacity of the military to protect a country and its inhabitants affected by corrupt practices in the defence sector?
Well, because of the very large contracts, often going into very many millions of dollars or euros involved in military expenditure, especially around arms procurement, and the secrecy of these contracts. Often there's a lot of secrecy involved. Many countries don't report that they're spending money on weapons. They're not saying how much money they're spending on. And certainly there's a lot of confidentiality clauses that are often built into these contracts. The combination of these two factors means that there's a good scope for people who are involved in corruption or want to pay bribes or facilitation fees or over-invoice. The scope for that is usually quite high. So there's been a lot of research internationally that looks at this problem. And what really happens then is that in many cases governments land up with weapons they can't always use. The specs are not always correct. And that then undermines the extent to which they can use those weapons for defense capacity. Or they might get weapons that are not effective for what they need, and they still have to rely on these weapons. So in many ways, corruption and corrupt practices in the defense sector does undermine the ability for a state to use or to secure itself the way it would ideally want to do.
It is interesting to note that during the years of global economic recession, there was a 24% increase of weapons transfers. Why is this a significant observation?
It's a significant observation because globally what we saw was a dramatic slowdown in the economy. So there was 0% interest in many countries. Many areas of government expenditure decreased. There was a lot of slashing of social spending. Around the world we saw this happening in quite a big degree because of the global financial meltdown. However, in the armaments industry it didn't have the same effect. So we saw that the commitments to spend money on weapons remained there, the contracts were enforced, and certainly countries that were really experiencing big problems, such as Greece and others, were concerned about adhering to their weapons contracts more than they were, for instance, social spending. So what we saw there is in that area where there's very little accountability, the states and those that are involved in weapons procurement seem to be quite happy to continue spending even when there was a need to cut down in other areas.
There are severe risks that can result in corruption in the defence sectors. What mechanisms are in place to reduce these risks?
Well, there are various things that can be done. The most important is transparency and oversight and accountability. Corruption is very difficult it's very difficult to be corrupt or to engage in corrupt practices when you have to be held accountable. So often, some of the areas of the transparency index that looks at the risk areas focuses on, for instance, is whether the budgets are properly made public, are they published, are decisions around procurement also open to scrutiny. So is there, for instance, a parliament that can oversee this? And are there committees made up of multi-party representation that can look at and ask questions? Why are you spending this amount? Do you need this kind of thing? And also, budgets on weapons procurement also come out of policy processes. So is the policy making process transparent? And then can you hold the executive accountable for spending money in line with those policies? So there's that. Are the budgets audited? Are there secret budgets? How much of it is secret? For instance, those are areas that would lead to accountability, which could minimize corruption. If the military, for instance, are allowed to get involved in commercial enterprises, that can also lead to corruption. So it's really about trying to minimize those risk areas, opening up accountability and transparency. And that will then reduce the risks and occurrence of corruption. And as I said earlier, at the moment, most countries, 70% of the countries surveyed, do not have adequate systems in place to ensure sufficient transparency and accountability for what they spend on weapons or on their militaries. And therefore, that is why there's a huge problem with corruption in that sector.
Tell us about South Africa's arms deal. How has it affected the institutions meant to uphold the rule of law and strengthen our democracy?
Well, the arms deal, the decision and the final decision to go through with this took place in 1999, but the process happened a bit earlier than that, and it resulted in the government committing 30 billion rands of taxpayers' money, public money, to buying weapons. The process, because it became so corrupted, meant that price stopped being a factor. So the initial technical specifications from the Defence Force, who said these are the weapons we need, came to about 8 billion rand. Once the politicians got a hold of it, the Minister of Defence senior people in government decided that price was no longer important. It rocketed to 30 billion rand. We now know from various investigations around here and around the world, and also that some of these armaments companies have paid fines because they've admitted to bribing South Africans in their own parliaments. Germany is one place. That the prices were inflated, the best possible weapons we could have got weren't purchased. We purchased weapons we don't need. So, for instance, we have a situation now with most of our fighter jets, trainers, are not being used. We can't afford to run them and maintain them. Our submarines, we don't use most of them most of the time. So we spend a huge amount of money buying weapons we don't need, can't use, and that money could have gone elsewhere. So the very direct cost is that it resulted in that money not being spent productively. So if we had spent that money, for instance, in infrastructure development, we could have created around 575,000 more jobs than we have to date currently. And this detail is contained in a very rigorous book that goes into the arms deal and looks at the offsets, all the lies that are told, and all the naivety that at least was shown by our politicians. But the corruption was created a huge opportunity cost for South Africa on the one hand. Unfortunately, because it was corrupt, and then as this information started coming out, we saw the institutions that are meant to strengthen the rule of law and uphold democracy and transparency being damaged. So we saw Auditor General reports being changed. We saw the undermining of the Portfolio Committee that was supposed to oversee the expenditure. We saw the Scorpions being shut down because they're investigating people involved in corruption. And so, and in order to maintain protection, people started being appointed into these situations, or into these high levels of the criminal justice system and security sector, more for their personal loyalties to those that are involved in the corruption than because they are the best person to run that institution. So we see, and across the organisation, they're in very key and senior positions, people who shouldn't be there. They're not trusted by the majority of those below them, NPA, the SAPS, the intelligence services. So the damage to our country has been quite dramatic. And some analysts argue that the arms deal was the door that opened up the floodgates of corruption. Because we weakened our systems for dealing with corruption through the arms deal, which is actually a tragedy, we now have a situation in which corruption is very difficult to control. It's widespread. We've dropped 14 places in the last 2 years on the Transparency International Perception of Corruption Index. We're losing around 30 billion rand a year of government spending to corruption. And there's very little willpower amongst the most senior people in government and the political elite to tackle corruption because they're trying to protect people, or they are directly involved in it.
What institutions and practices can and do mitigate the risk of corruption in South Africa?
Well, once again, as I mentioned earlier, it's about transparency. So it's about making sure that there are no secret contracts, that weapons procurement is done openly, transparently, that the parliamentary oversight committees are playing their role to make sure that the weapons are being bought are really going to be used, are needed, and that when we get these inducements to buy weapons from certain companies, and they're often called offset deals. So these weapons companies say, if you buy weapons from us, we will set up a factory or a smelter or something like that, that those are carefully monitored and adhered to, and that when people break their promises, that they're held accountable in law, and that the money that should have been coming to us is recuperated. So if that was the case, then we would really sort of make a big progress towards tackling corruption, and of course strengthening the rule of law, making sure that the people you appoint to run the police, to head the National Prosecuting Authority, in charge of intelligence services, are the best possible people. They're there to uphold the Constitution, to do their jobs without fear or favour, to fight corruption and crime no matter where it occurs, and are not being appointed because they have direct political or personal loyalties to individuals who are corrupt. And that's one of our biggest weaknesses in South Africa. There's this idea that you can't appoint often the best person to the job at the most senior parts of the organisation, and very compromised people are placed there. And that then weakens those organizations. They're not run properly. The personnel who have to do the investigations don't trust their bosses. And it really weakens the state's capacity to fight corruption and save all that money from being stolen.
You mentioned that South Africa has slipped down the global rankings as perceptions of corruption have increased, yet you take heart that corruption evokes anger amongst South Africans rather than resignation. How best can we avoid such a tipping point in South Africa?
Well, it's really important for South African citizens to be aware of what's going on and put pressure on the government to fight corruption. The reason why there's so much corruption being reported on in the newspapers is because people are outraged by it and want to know about it. And that's a very positive dynamic. It's because we have an active citizenry, we have a civil society that's very vibrant, we have courageous investigative reporters who place themselves under considerable risk often when they try to investigate these cases. And then, of course, you have an independent judiciary. So those are very important and fundamental pillars that all work together to help expose this stuff. What we're lacking really is a political will to deal with corruption in South Africa. So it's glaringly absent. We keep on seeing very senior people in government being implicated in corruption, and very little happens to follow up. They're just not held accountable. So ministers, deputy ministers, senior officials who are politically connected, the expose happens, and they're not subject to proper criminal investigations. And I think it's up to South Africans to put pressure on the government and say that this is not sufficient. So we need an active citizenry to really raise our voices and to say we are tired of watching senior politicians divert resources away from public spending into their own back pockets. And that is already happening. The dramatic increase in public violence, often located at community levels, people protesting against failed service delivery, is part of that frustration. People see local government officials driving around in very fancy cars, living in nice houses, but they see the services around them deteriorating, and they know the money is not going to where it should be going.
Can you tell us about the progress of the Sarita Commission? What do you think are the chief tasks for this commission, and what would you like to see the commission achieve? And finally, has it perhaps already been irrevocably tarnished by the allegations from some of its members that it may be involved in a cover-up?
Well, the Sarita Commission occurred because the President was about to lose a constitutional court case which would have compelled him to set the Commission up. And many analysts believe that the Commission only withdrew at the very last minute in order not to have the terms of reference set by the Constitutional Court, and rather be able to take some kind of control over that. And already some analysis of the terms of reference show that the Commission, once it receives evidence, can then keep that evidence secret. Once the final report has been drafted by the Commission, the President has no obligation to make the report public, and there's no obligation to compel the President to act on any of the recommendations. And those are kinds of terms of reference that possibly the Constitutional Court would not have allowed, or might have been a bit more circumspect about placing into the terms of reference. On the one hand, the Commission is ready to find out what happened. We don't really need a Commission inquiry, in my personal opinion. We know there's corruption, we know who's involved. There's enough evidence there that a body such as the Hawks, and certainly various investigation agencies, should be tracing the money, finding out who is involved in what bribery, and there's more than enough evidence out there. The Hawks, who were given 4 million documents detailing the corruption that took place. There's been a lot of this exposed internationally, so it's easy to get that information. We know who's involved. So ideally, we'd rather just have prosecutions so that those who are corrupt can be held directly accountable. We can recuperate the money that was wasted. That would be the way to go. The Commission inquiry, unfortunately, can be used by senior politicians as a way to divert attention. So they can say, well, we're dealing with this Commission inquiry, can go on. But we've seen this before. During apartheid, the Harms Commission just allowed the police to get covered up for police misconduct and murders. We saw a commission go into corruption in the prisons, gone for 4 years, and very little came out of that. So commissions of inquiry don't have a good history in South Africa as being a way of fundamentally changing a situation. But they're better than nothing if you want to get to some kind of truth. So hopefully the commission inquiry will be able to consider all the evidence and come up with some key recommendations. Of course, however, one of the senior investigators has resigned and made allegations that there was a double agenda going on, and that the Commission inquiry has actually been there to try and clear the government and to discredit the witnesses and those that have been complaining about corruption. So, and that's been allegations being made, but it hasn't been satisfactorily been responded to. The Commission inquiry simply said they just don't agree and they dismiss it. So that's already raised a lot of eyebrows. Ideally, would have a very clear response. And it's so important that this Commission inquiry is seen as being objective and neutral. So if there's any perception that it isn't, ideally you'd have the President rather just replace the chairperson so we can move forward with somebody that everybody trusts. So we'll have to see. The jury is still out. If the Commission is able to act in a transparent and rigorous manner, we all know this because the evidence it's looking at has been gathered. It's in different places around the world. So if it tries to cover up, it'll just undermine its own credibility in the long term. Hopefully it'll do the right thing, and we'll be able to get to the bottom of this.
That was Gareth Newham of the ISS discussing corruption in the defence sector.